Yes, I mean, for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak, Kevin. I'm very happy to be here doing this with you. I'm gonna share my screen because I have a lot of PowerPoint slides to show you, and this is the easiest way to do that. Even though we want to focus on the military coup of the 3rd of July, 2013, it's very difficult to understand anything in Egypt today without talking about the role of the army in politics, which became prominent with what I would call the revolutionary coup of the 23rd of July, 1952. So what you see here is on the top left, the military junta called the Free Officers, which was led by Gamal Abdel Nasser here. They ousted the monarchy, ousted the British occupation. Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Here is the banner headline in the most important daily newspaper in Egypt announcing that. And here is Nasser at the Suez Canal. Nasser was genuinely popular, not only in Egypt, not only throughout the Arab world, but also broadly in what we would call today the global South. The Nasser regime was also an authoritarian regime in which the army had an outsized role in politics. I'm not going to get into a broad analysis of that here, just to mention that this is where the army draws its legitimacy from. And if you want to read what I have to say about that, you can check out this article that I wrote in Jacobin last year. So what we have then is what Yazid Sayyid called an officers' republic. So from 1952 until today, I would argue, there are three components to Egypt's ruling class. One, the military officer corps. Two, the internal security apparatus. Three, the political elites, many of whom are retired officers. And beginning in the mid-2000s, a private sector business class. So the man who most represents the internal security forces during the Mubarak period is Omar Suleiman, who was known as the CIA's man in Egypt. He had been head of the military intelligence, but he shifted over to be the director of General Intelligence Directorate. That's something like the MI6, I think. So he was acceptable to the army, but was definitely a suit and tie man. And he was a strong anti-Islamist and participated in all the extraordinary renditions, which you see this map of on the slide. So Nasser died in 1970, and the combination of the Arab defeat in the '67 war and his death pretty much symbolized the end of the program of Arab socialism and Arab nationalism that Nasser advocated. There was an Arab New Left, but it was weak and short-lived, and Anwar Sadat succeeded Nasser as president after his death in 1970. He was able to partially rehabilitate the army as a result of the partial victory of Egypt in the 1973 war with Israel. And he increasingly civilianized the upper echelons of politics by pushing the army officer elements out. The big exception to that, of course, was Sadat's vice president, Hosni Mubarak, who became president after Sadat's assassination in 1981. In 1991, the neoliberal project, which of course is a global project promoted by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United States government, of course, and other international financial institutions. In 1991, it began to accelerate very markedly in Egypt, and even more so in 2003 after a new unified labor law was passed, which confirmed that the Egyptian Trade Union Federation continued to be and continues to be today, as it has been since it was established in 1957, an apparatus of the state. Very important politically, and this has to do with the coup and all that preceded it, as part of the neoliberal project after 1991, senior officers were incorporated into the civilian political system through the promise of a loyalty allowance. So when they retired, in exchange for abstaining from politics while they were in the army, they received a lump of cash and also sometimes sinecures as heads of public sector business organizations or government agencies. So senior officers had a huge stake in the status quo. Now, in the mid-1990s, this new element of the Egyptian ruling elite emerged into full view, and that is the private sector business people whose political leader, if you will, was Gamal Mubarak. Here he is, the second son of President Hosni Mubarak here. And these are all the members of the cabinet that came into office in July of 2004, which was called the Government of Businessmen, because all of these guys were CEOs of private sector businesses or had worked for the IMF or the World Bank. One or two of them even had dual citizenship with Canada. So this was an effort to draw Egypt more closely into the global capitalist market. And they were pretty successful in doing that. And consequently, there was almost immediately a big response to it of resistance, not only of workers, that's what I'm emphasizing here, but there were other elements as well. So, oops, let me go back to that. So here you can see this is mid-2004 when the Government of Businessmen came into office, and boom, there's an immediate increase in the number of strikes and other labor collective actions, which didn't peak with the popular uprising of 2011, but continued to escalate afterwards. And we'll get to that in a bit. So here's another representation of that, which again shows you that while the strike wave and wave of collective action by the working class began actually in the late 1990s with huge numbers compared to the mid-1980s and early 1990s, when you're talking about roughly 30 strikes and collective actions a year. And here we're already up to 114, but big jump in 2004 to 266 that year. Now, I don't have numbers for the numbers of workers involved because strikes were illegal and they were reported variously in the Egyptian press, sometimes on the basis of a phone call where the reporter didn't even go to the spot and didn't get all the facts straight. So these are roughly accurate, but still not 100% accurate numbers. So basically, what all of that meant was the political influence of the army was declining, and particularly because, oops, we want to go here, because Hosni Mubarak, and especially his wife Suzanne, were beginning to set things in motion for Gamal Mubarak to succeed Hosni Mubarak, who was already in his 80s in the mid-2000s, as president. So all these forces are in the background of the 25th of January 2011 popular uprising, which had several different aspects which were not well integrated with each other. So first take on what the 25th of January 2011 uprising was. It was a protest against police torture and other abuses. And the 25th of January is Police Day in Egypt. And so demonstrations were called. to protest the police rather than celebrate them. And the thing that really powered this set, the earliest demonstrations on January 25th was a campaign called We Are All Khalid Said. Khalid Said was a young man in Alexandria who was murdered by the police. It's not even clear why they did it, just because they behaved brutally the way police do. People who are familiar with Black Lives Matter and similar movements globally will know about that. And Wael Ghanem, who was the head of marketing for Google in the Middle East and North Africa, set up this Facebook page, We Are All Khalid Said, anonymously, of course, and with his tech skills, he knew how to do that. And it was big. They got 65, 70,000 people on the Facebook page, and that was one of the big motors of the initial January 25th demonstration. More broadly, the urban middle class intelligentsia for a decade had been engaged in various protests, none of them very, very big or very, very long lasting, but still there was a sense of a culture of protest for the decade, focusing on demands for democratization, an end to corruption, which is endemic in Egypt. One of the groups that emerged around that campaign, there were several others, was the April 6th youth movement, A6YM. This logo here to the right was their logo. And you can tell by the raised fist, which is taken from the Serbian Otpor movement, that this is where they are drawing their anti-corruption, pro-democracy discourse from, with some input from American activists as well. These people, generally speaking, had very little regular contact with workers. So there is this huge strike wave, unprecedented since the post-World War II period in Egypt, going on throughout the decade. And there's the urban middle class intelligentsia in motion around these other issues. And there are some people who bridge the gap. So here is one of them. This is a demonstration that took place in May of 2010 to demand a monthly minimum wage of what would then have been $200 a month. Most of the people in this picture are not workers. Most of the people in this picture are exactly those urban middle class activists. But in this particular group, and this is why I chose this photo, you've got Khalid Ali here, who was the executive director of the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights, and some other activists here who have been longtime supporters of labor rights in Egypt. So they understood the importance of the worker strike movement, which was focused on questions like loss of jobs, social benefits, and job security due to the privatization of public sector enterprises and other neoliberal measures. Those strikes and workers' collective actions very rarely, very exceptionally, said anything about democracy, although some of these people in this picture were also among leading members of the pro-democracy protests of the decade of the 2000s. The first time that workers, as opposed to just people who participated in various political actions, connected with the forces, the middle-class forces of the uprising, was during the protracted occupation of Tahrir Square. So this is January 30th, this picture. Tahrir Square had been occupied already for 5 days, since January 25th. And a group of trade unionists, supported by some of the pro-working class urban intelligentsia, formed the Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions, as distinct from the Egyptian Trade Union Federation, which again is an arm of the regime. And these people came out and say, we support the demands of the popular revolution, and we call for a general strike. well, okay, anybody who's done any trade union organizing knows that a trade union federation that organized yesterday and which represents maybe 5% at best of the working class, not going to be able to call for a successful general strike. The organizational apparatus, the logistics, who people ask quite justifiably, who are you who are asking me to go on strike and why should I follow you? So this aspect of what they were trying to do was not particularly successful, although obviously Mubarak was toppled on February 11th. But the participation of elements of the working class in the uprising emboldened people, and consequently, following Mubarak, well, in the few days before Mubarak's demise, there were very large strikes in many places. And then especially after he was already gone, the dam broke loose. And so you can see here, this is February 2011, the month of Mubarak's demise, huge numbers of collective actions, both. This is almost as many as there were in the entire several years annually before. And altogether, during 2011, 1,419 collective actions. My judgment is nearly 1 million participants. Other Egypt watchers have different figures, but so I just basically averaged them out. So definitely there was a working class presence in the movement to oust Mubarak, but especially that working class presence grew after Mubarak was ousted and became part of the movement for democratizing Egyptian society. The third element of the January 25th popular uprising was exactly not very popular, because remember that the army is not happy that Gamal Mubarak, the son of former President Hosni Mubarak, was being groomed to succeed his father with support from his cohort of civilian businessmen. Gamal Mubarak had not been in the army. People in the army didn't trust him. So they're nervous about what's going to happen. And then when there's a popular uprising, they jump right on. Now, Stratfor, which is kind of a civilian CIA, but it's a private enterprise, it's not a government institution, actually put out a report that said that the Egyptian army was planning Mubarak's ouster before the popular uprising. Maybe, maybe not. And the extent to which that actually had operational part to it is unclear, but certainly there were many people in the ranks of the senior officer class who were not happy with Gamal Mubarak, and therefore, at first, were very supportive of the popular uprising and joined it. So here you see soldiers participating in the uprising, and people are chanting, "The army and the people are one hand." What kind of popular uprising raises a slogan like that when the army has been one of the important pillars of the ruling class of the regime? Well, to understand this, we have to go back to Nasser. Nasser was a military man. It was a military junta that carried out a coup that ended the monarchy, that ended the British occupation, that nationalized the Suez Canal, that made Egypt an important force in the Arab world and in the global South. So the army had that legitimacy. But the army quickly established its own agenda. So Hosni Mubarak, for most of the time he was president from 1981 until January 2011, didn't have a vice president. He appointed Omar Suleiman as vice president as the popular uprising was gaining steam and it looked like he was in trouble. And that was considered a safe bet because he had been in the army people knew him, he would be acceptable, but he actually represents at this point the element of the ruling class that is the biggest competitor of the army, the internal security forces. So he, on February 11th, announced Mubarak's resignation. Mubarak never said anything publicly about that, and basically said, and we're handing over responsibility for the country to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which assumed executive power on February 11th. And here are some of them, some of the leading members of them. There were altogether about 20 of them. Nobody had ever heard of these people because this body had never met. I mean, people knew who some of the names of the generals were, but here they are all over the way. We had popular uprising, and now there is a military junta in control. And the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, in concert with the Muslim Brothers, pushed for two things: an early constitutional referendum, which happened on March 19th and which adopted a revised constitution, and early parliamentary elections, the first round of which was in December of 2011. But after the constitutional amendment passed, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, at the end of the month, on the 30th of March, said, here are amendments to the Constitutional Declaration, which basically said, we're in charge and no civilian forces can have anything to do about the army and its prerogatives, and we're not subjecting the military budget, to civilian authority, to the parliament, and so on. So effectively, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces ruled from February 2011 until Mohamed Morsi, a representative of the Muslim Brothers, was inaugurated as president on the 30th of June 2012. So during that period, there was a struggle between the major forces in the country, the Muslim Brothers, the army, and the popular forces. And you can see that in this graffiti here, which says no to military rule, and in this demonstration, which is a protest of the Maspero massacre. The Maspero massacre of October 2011 began as a demonstration in which the majority of the participants were Coptic Christians, but there were also Muslims as well. A church had burned down, and the demonstration was in protest of that. And then they sat in front of the television and radio studio in the Maspero neighborhood, and the army and police moved in and killed 24 and wounded 212 of them, which is to say that this was an indication that actually not all that much happened. That was different from the Mubarak regime. This would have happened pretty much the same way under Mubarak, including the burning of the church, because there were lots of those things. There was a church burned the month before Mubarak, the demonstrations against Mubarak began in December of 2010. When the parliament was finally elected, the second round of the elections were in January of 2012. 75% of the parliament members were Islamists, 49% Muslim Brothers, and the rest of them Salafis. And as a result, the parliament was soon dissolved by the Supreme Court, which was an institution whose composition had not changed from the Mubarak era. Judges, generally speaking, are secularists, although that's a complicated and problematic term in Egypt. It doesn't mean what we think it means in the UK or in the United States. Well, certainly not what we think of in the United States, because we don't have a state religion here. In Egypt, you do have, as you do in the UK, a state religion. So these are the results of the first round of the presidential elections. And I show them to you here because they show you the political spectrum. So the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohamed Morsi barely came in first in the first round. The regime candidate, Ahmed Shafiq, came in second, close second. Surprisingly close third, Hamdin Sabahi, who was the head of the Nasserist party. So the legacy of Nasser was still alive and well, and people were hoping for a restoration of the social contract that the Nasser regime expressed. Abdul Munam Abul Fatouh was at one point one of the leading and most promising young members of the Muslim Brotherhood, but he took some distance from them and took with him when he left a good number of followers. That's expressed here. Amr Musa was foreign minister under the old regime. So this is kind of corrupt old regime. This is less corrupt or perceived to be less corrupt old regime. And the left is here, number 7 and 8. Khalid Ali, who I mentioned already, who was the director of the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights, and Abul Iz al-Hariri, a well-known leftist from Alexandria, but their numbers all combined are less than 1%. So that's a pretty good indication of the actual distribution of organized political forces. And one of the reasons for holding rapid elections in Egypt was so that you would get this outcome, because only the Muslim Brothers had the kind of nationwide apparatus that could allow them to successfully challenge the forces of the old regime. And the army at first thought that that was okay, if they would be the ones who would inherit Mubarak. So in the second round, Mohamed Morsi received 51.7% of the vote against Ahmed Shafiq. That's not exactly a broad mandate. He barely squeaked by, but he overreached. The Muslim Brothers had no experience in running anything because they'd been illegal until 2011. They tried to put their supporters in key positions and angered all sorts of people. They tried to reconvene the parliament that the Supreme Court had declared was illegally elected. And then the last straw was on the 22nd of November, 2012, Morsi issued a constitutional decree basically saying any decision, any presidential decree that he issued was immune from review by the constitutional courts, basically establishing him as a dictator. So there were large public popular demonstrations against him for doing that. The army was never 100% happy with the Muslim Brothers, but now they had an opening, because here there was obviously popular opposition to the Muslim Brothers. The popular opposition was unorganized, didn't have a unified political program, but it could be manipulated, and it was. So in April of 2013, a campaign called Tamarrud, which means rebel, was organized, with many of the early leaders being middle-class urban intellectuals who had participated in some of the protest movements of the 2000s. And they began a campaign of collecting signatures on a petition to hold early presidential elections, which is to say, to hold a recall vote on Mohamed Morsi less than a year after he was inaugurated as president. So you can see here some of the themes that were mobilized in this campaign, all of which are mendacious. So here is Gamal Abdel Nasser suggesting that what would happen if Morsi was removed would be that a candidate resembling Nasser would become president. Absolutely no chance of that happening. Not only was there not such a person in Egypt, but the international situation would not permit such a thing. Here on the top right, it says, Tamarrud says no to foreign intervention with the American flag, as if to say the Americans are supporting the Muslim Brothers, which the Americans were not totally unhappy with the Muslim Brothers. There was a certain amount of caution, but they were not hardcore opposed, but neither were they actually promoting them. This banner says the workers of Misr Spinning and Weaving Company, which is the largest industrial complex in Egypt, with then something around 20,000 workers, are signing on to oppose Mohamed Morsi. And here's a poster, Mohamed Morsi Mubarak, with half of the face of Mohamed Morsi and half Hosni Mubarak, which is to say there's no difference between the two of them, which isn't a reasonable argument for what was actually going on. I mean, not that Morsi was particularly democratic. He was not, but these are two different, they represent two different political forces. As a result of this petition campaign, there were enormous demonstrations on the 30th of June, 2013. Somewhere between 15 to 22 million signatures were gathered on the petition for early elections. Impossible to be accurate about that. It became clear afterwards, however, that it was the army, and particularly military intelligence, funded by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that was behind this campaign. And one of the founders of Tamarud, who had been a political activist demanding democracy in the Mubarak era, a year later said, I felt like a dirty game was being played on us. We were somehow used. Well, absolutely, they were used. So I'm going to shift the share here to something else because I think this is a pretty good way to see what was going on. And it comes from the New York Times, and you'll forgive me for that, I hope, but it's not too bad as a report.
During the last 4 days in Egypt, political tensions rose, leading to a showdown on Wednesday between President Mohamed Morsi and the Egyptian military. On Sunday, millions of protesters gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square, calling for Morsi's resignation. This came exactly 1 year after he was inaugurated as Egypt's first democratically elected president. Demonstrators also set fire to the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood and ransacked it the following day.
وتمهل الجميع 48 ساعة كفرصة أخيرة.
On Monday, the head of the Egyptian military announced an ultimatum against Morsi. He said the army would impose their own roadmap for the future if the president did not address the protesters' demands for a more inclusive government and resign within 48 hours. Meanwhile, mass protests continued across Egypt, with Morsi opponents protesting in front of the presidential palace. Morsi's government soon started showing cracks. 6 ministers resigned, including the foreign minister. On Tuesday night, President Morsi defied the military's ultimatum in a live televised speech. He declared himself the legitimate leader of Egypt and said he would pay the ultimate price.
والحفاظ على الشرعية ثمن الحفاظ عليها حياتي. حياتي أنا عايز أحافظ على حياتكم كلكم.
More deadly protests erupted Tuesday night. At least 18 people were killed at a pro-Morsi rally at Cairo University, and more than 300 people were wounded. As the ultimatum deadline approached Wednesday afternoon, the military published a Facebook post called The Final Hours, saying, quote, "We swear to God to sacrifice our blood for Egypt and its people against every terrorist or extremist or ignorant person." After the deadline passed, the president's spokesman released a defiant statement on Facebook. But early Wednesday evening, tanks and troops moved toward the presidential palace. And soon after, the military officially removed Morsi from power. They suspended the constitution and installed an interim government. Just as when Mubarak fell, in Tahrir Square, there were fireworks celebrations. But elsewhere, the Muslim Brotherhood was upset and vowing to continue the fight.
Okay, so now we'll go back to the other share and resume where we had been before. So that was the coup.
And
That,
it's so busted,
Whoa,
you can't
whoa,
use
whoa.
this part of the screen. Definitely cracked every phone
hold
I've owned.
on, hold on.
You
here.
broke your phone, so Verizon
Oh,
broke the
dear.
rules. For the first time ever, new and current customers can trade in their old and damaged
Hang on.
phones for up to $800 off our best 5G phones.
The phone is old, very
Oh,
old.
dear, dear, dear.
Old,
Hang on.
cracked, water damaged, doesn't
I'm
matter.
ready for something new.
Now, trade up to the 5G network you deserve with the 5G phone you want. Because at Verizon,
Sorry about that. There we go. Now we're back to where we want to be. Okay, so forces for and against the coup, and this is actually a little bit unexpected, perhaps, if you're watching Egypt from the outside. So the army and the intelligence services, of course, the Egyptian Trade Union Federation, which, as I said, is an arm of the regime, of course, most of the secular liberals and left, and especially feminists who were terrified of what the Muslim Brothers might do, most of the independent trade union movement, which had flourished and grown very impressively during the period since Mubarak's ouster, the Salafis. Why the Salafis? Aren't they Islamic radicals like the Muslim Brothers? Well, no, they're not. They have a different theology, and they are more in line with Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, as I mentioned, provided a certain amount of funding for the coup. Who were the opponents of the coup? There were, to be fair, some elements of the left were suspicious from the beginning, but really the vast majority of liberals and the left supported the coup, and some of them still do today. The main body of opponents, of course, the Muslim Brothers, because it's their man who's getting booted out, and they are being supported by Qatar, Tunisia, and Turkey, all of whom at that point were being ruled by forces friendly to the Muslim Brothers, and the African Union, which based on the principle that they simply don't approve of military coups that change constituted power. That was their reasoning. So you can see from, and then of course, as Abdel Fattah al-Sisi said in the video clip that I just played, the Muslim Brothers are terrorists, or their supporters are ignorant. There's just basically no reasonable basis for any Egyptian supporting the Muslim Brothers, which means that you're writing off a huge proportion of the population, because after all, Morsi did get more than 50% of the vote for the presidency. So demonstrations, as the video clip mentioned, began very soon after the coup, and even before it. And there were the army and security forces who killed people and wounded people. But then big demonstration gathered for many days at the square in front of a major mosque in Heliopolis, the Rabb al-Adawiya mosque. And on the 14th of August, 2013, the army and the police moved in and simply mowed people down. At least 817 people were killed, many more wounded. Probably safe to say 1,000, maybe even more. And if these are Human Rights Watch's numbers. So this was a major big deal. And the basis for all of this was, well, these are terrorists. They have weapons, they are going to overthrow the regime by force, most of which was false or very much overplayed, which again is not to say that the Muslim Brothers were a democratic force. They were not, they are not, which is not to say that the Muslim Brothers had not done many shady things during their period in power. They did, which is not to say that the Muslim Brothers, if they had a chance, would have very likely seriously constricted, even more than was already the case, the freedom of women. They certainly would have tried to do that. But the question is, does all of that amount to a justification for a massacre of this proportion? Now, what was the role of the United States in all of this? So in the very beginning, I didn't mention this, the United States was supportive of Mubarak. Hillary Clinton went to Egypt, said that Mubarak had to be part of the solution. They sent a former ambassador to Egypt, who had also been in the CIA, and he said, yeah, Mubarak has to stay. So in the beginning, the United States was supportive of Mubarak, but at a certain point, it became clear, no, this is a losing game, we can't do this. And they went along with it. They were very nervous about the ascendancy of the Muslim Brothers and the other Islamists. The brothers invited a delegation of American businessmen to visit Egypt and basically said to them, you guys are for free enterprise, we're for free enterprise, we can get along, there's absolutely nothing at the level of economic policy on which we would have a fundamental difference. Bring your money and invest in Egypt. And it seemed like that could happen. But there was this chaotic year in which the Muslim Brothers were overreaching and doing increasingly anti-democratic things. And the real core of the American relationship with Egypt has been for decades with the army. The army was very unhappy. And so after the coup, Secretary of State John Kerry announced that the military was restoring democracy. The military did not take over to the best of our judgment so far, which is a blatant lie. The military was not restoring democracy because there was not very much democracy to begin with. Yes, Morsi was democratically elected, but the electoral law was very constricting. There was a free parliamentary election, again, under very constricting electoral law, but the Supreme Court dissolved the parliament. Why did the United States take this seriously ridiculous position? Because if Kerry had acknowledged that a coup had occurred, American law would have required that the United States suspend its $1.3 billion a year in military aid, which is the second largest amount of annual military aid that the United States gives to any other country. The first is obviously Israel. So here is Kerry meeting with the generals, and this is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the guy who eventually came out on top. Because at first he said, after the coup of July 3rd, 2013, no, the army is getting out of politics. But then he resigned his commission and ran for president in the June 24th elections, which were utterly undemocratic. And there he's been ever since. So political repression increased after the coup. There was a sharp decline in labor actions, but political repression across the board. My specialty is labor, so I focus on this, and you can see from this graph that, boom, right after in the second half of 2013, sharp decline. But still, this number of collective actions of labor, 50-ish in December of 2013, that's historic high above the 30-ish in the 1980s and 1990s nonetheless. And during the summer and fall of 2015 and early 2016, early winter 2016, there was a big upsurge of labor protests. So this is a huge strike at Misr Spinning and Weaving. The numbers of workers have been sharply reduced to about 14,000 by this time, but it's still enormous. And they had been one of the most active and most militant groups of workers throughout the decade of the 2000s. They had, in fact, raised some political demands where others did not. They were joined by 8,000 textile workers in Kafra Dawar, which has both Misr mills and also others. And both strikes were successful. The Misr Spinning and Weaving workers did get their profit share bonus and food allowance, and the Kafra Dawar workers did get a bonus retroactive to July. So this was looking relatively good, and followed by, I'm not going to get into all of these details here, but these ones that I've marked in red here, these are huge numbers of workers and absolutely critical institutions and workplaces in Egypt. So the hold of the military was not absolute until after this wave of working class protest was suppressed. And it was suppressed. It was suppressed violently. Independent trade union leaders were arrested, in some cases shot, and every kind of dissident political opinion was suppressed. So today, there are some 65,000 political prisoners in Egypt. We obviously cannot know the correct, accurate number since the regime is not telling us. People are detained without charges every week and for long periods of time. They're simply disappeared, as was the case in Argentina previously, or Turkey. Torture is absolutely endemic and normal. There's been a huge crackdown on LGBTIQ+ people. There was a public concert of a rock band called Maspero from Lebanon, whose frontman is openly gay. Some people at the concert unfurled a rainbow flag, and boom, they were arrested. The police tried to identify them all and put them in jail, and they did catch a lot of them. This is Shaima Sabah, a member of the small Socialist People's Alliance Party, but what I would call an expression of the healthy left in Egypt. They were putting together a memorial march toward Tahrir Square, just about 3 or 4 blocks long is what they intended to do. Totally peaceful. She was shot dead with birdshot because she was at the head of the demonstration. She was a political leader, a poet. She was 31 years old. And the police and the army said that, well, it's her own fault that she died because she's so thin, and the birdshot wouldn't have killed somebody who had more flesh on their bones. You can see she's a rather slight woman here. Another woman whose name just by chance happens also to be Shaima Ahmad, who performs under the name Shaima, was jailed for inciting debauchery because she put a music video on TikTok in December of 2017, which was considered indecent, which by conservative Egyptian standards was racy, but it was hardly a threat to the security of the country. There were small demonstrations in Egypt in 2019 around the same time that there were waves of popular movements in Iraq and in Lebanon, alongside ones that had started up earlier in Algeria and Sudan. So there was a big wave of popular resistance throughout the region, beginning in December of 2018 and continued until the COVID crisis. 4,400 people were arrested in response to that, the biggest roundup in Egypt in many, many years. There are currently some 30 journalists in jail in Egypt, which is the 3rd highest number in the world. At least 9 doctors and 2 pharmacists were arrested because they criticized the government's COVID-19 response. One video that went viral was of a nurse who collapsed and began crying on the floor of a treatment room because they didn't have enough oxygen to revive COVID patients who needed it. And she's in charge of taking care of people who are dying, and she can't do anything about it. And she got in trouble for crying and for that video. And to make all of this even worse, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi pushed through constitutional amendments which would allow him to rule until 2030, which all indications are that he will try to do exactly that. So thank you for your attention, and I suppose we are now going to have some discussion.